Working at the city library had always been my refuge. For over 30 years, I organized shelves, cataloged books, and helped readers find what they needed. The silence of the pages was my only companion, and I liked it that way. But lately, the silence had turned into something different, something unsettling. It all started subtly, almost imperceptibly. Some sections of the library, especially the more isolated ones, were always empty, and I preferred to ignore them. It wasn't common for readers to visit those dusty shelves where the old, seldom-read books sat. Even so, every time I passed by to check, something seemed out of place. I couldn't quite put my finger on it until the whispers began. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the wind slipping through the poorly sealed windows, or perhaps the old wood of the shelves creaking. But these whispers were different, continuous, almost like muffled conversations, always around the same shelves. Sometimes they sounded distant, as if coming from the far end of the corridor. Other times, they were so close it felt like someone was whispering directly into my ear. And strangely, they seemed to be calling my name. The first time I heard my name whispered, I froze. I stood still in the middle of the aisle, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. After all, spending so much time in a place like this, surrounded by silence and solitude, could affect anyone. But the more I tried to ignore it, the louder the whispers grew. It was on a particularly cold afternoon that I decided to follow the whispers. They came from the local history section, a part of the library rarely visited. The shelves were covered in dust, and the books seemed untouched for years. Yet one specific volume among all of them was clean, as if someone had recently handled it. Hesitant, I approached and pulled the book from the shelf. It was an old journal, written by an unknown author, detailing life in the town over a century ago. As I flipped through the journal, I found something that left me stunned. Within its pages were accounts of several disappearances that had occurred in the town decades earlier. People who, according to the journal, had vanished inside the very library. The whispers seemed to grow louder as I read, and I realized that the names mentioned in the journal matched those I had seen on dedication plaques in some of the oldest books. It was as if those people somehow were still present in the library. My curiosity turned to fear when I began to feel a presence behind me, a shadow moving silently as I flipped through the book. With each page I turned, the air around me grew heavier, and the whispers became clearer, like a crowd of voices all speaking at once, surrounding me, watching me. The words in the journal became harder to read, almost as if they were distorting right in front of me. I slammed the book shut and hastily placed it back on the shelf. The silence returned, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I hurried out of that section, trying to appear calm, but inside, the fear was growing. In the days that followed, I tried to continue my routine, but the whispers never stopped. They followed me through every aisle, growing more insistent. It was then that I realized something disturbing. The oldest books, the ones I had never really noticed before, had something in common. They were all dedicated to people who had disappeared. People who, according to the journal, were never seen again after their last visits to the library. And now, it seemed I was the next in line to hear their secrets. I had always been a frequent visitor to the city library. Since I was a child, I would spend hours there, diving into the pages of books and losing myself in stories that transported me to other worlds. Over time, it became almost a ritual for me, a weekly visit always at the same time. It was my refuge, until the day I started noticing something strange. It was a winter evening, and I was seated at one of the tables in the back of the library when I saw him for the first time. A man, sitting a few tables ahead, leafing through a thick, dark-covered book. First, I didn't think much of it. Despite the library being nearly empty at that hour, it still occasionally received a few late visitors. He didn't seem any different from anyone else, except for one detail. He never looked up. First, it was just a coincidence. He was always there when I arrived, and when I left, he was still in the same position, hunched over the same book. I never saw his face clearly because he was always looking down, reading with a concentration I envied. However, after a few weeks, I began to notice something was wrong. The man was there every night, always in the same spot, reading the same book in the same posture. I never saw him turn a page. I never saw him switch books. I never saw him get up, not even once. It was as if he were stuck in that moment, always quiet, always present, but at the same time, absent. There was something about his presence that disturbed me deeply, though I couldn't explain why. One night, I decided to stay late, determined to see the moment when he would finally get up to leave. The library closed at 9, and I remained at my table until the last minute, waiting. The other visitors left, and the lights began to turn off one by one. The librarian, an elderly woman who knew me well, made her final round and waved goodbye to me before she left. I was alone, except, of course, for the man. He was still there, sitting, reading as if time didn't affect him. The library was almost completely dark now, except for the faint light illuminating our area. I decided to approach, curious. Perhaps he was a dedicated professor or a scholar who got lost in the pages and didn't notice the passage of time. But as I got closer, a chill ran down my spine. Something was definitely wrong. When I finally reached him, my heart nearly stopped. The book he was holding was old, dusty, and its pages were blank. He wasn't reading anything. And then, without lifting his head, he spoke. It wasn't like any other voice I had heard. It was low, barely audible, like a murmur coming from somewhere far away. I couldn't understand what he said, but his voice seemed to echo off the walls of the library. I stood frozen, unable to move or respond. All I knew was that something terrible was happening. Without thinking twice, I turned and ran for the exit. When I reached the door, I glanced back one last time. The man was still there, motionless, his head bowed over the book as if nothing had happened. But deep down, I knew he wasn't an ordinary visitor. In the days that followed, I tried to find out more about him. I asked the librarian, who told me she had never seen anyone matching his description, and on those nights, I was usually the last visitor. Intrigued, I searched the city's records and found a mention of a man who, decades ago, spent every night in the library, reading tirelessly. He had tragically died in an accident, but his body was never found. Now, whenever I return to the library, I avoid that table. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel that he's there, sitting in silence, reading his empty book. When I started working at the library, I was just an inexperienced intern. I had always been fascinated by books, and that place felt magical to me. But after a few weeks, I began noticing strange things, especially in the rare books section. There was something peculiar about how some volumes seemed to disappear. I spent hours organizing shelves and helping visitors, but when I was alone, that section felt unsettling. A book I had cataloged the day before would simply vanish from its shelf, only to reappear hours later in a different place. First, I thought it was my mistake. Maybe I wasn't paying enough attention, or perhaps another staff member had moved the books without telling me. But as time went on, I realized the books weren't just being moved. Something was happening to them. One of the first books I noticed disappearing and reappearing was a collection of old stories. When I found it again on the wrong shelf, my curiosity got the better of me. I opened the book to check, and what I saw surprised me. The contents had changed. It was no longer the same collection of stories. Now, the tales described bizarre and inexplicable events that seemed to take place inside the library itself. Details I was certain hadn't been there before. The stories spoke of dark hallways, shadows moving between the shelves, and voices whispering the names of people who were never seen again. I thought it was some kind of sick joke. Maybe someone had swapped the pages. But the more I read, the more familiar the details became. Some of the stories mentioned people I knew, staff members, regular visitors, and strange events surrounding their disappearances. I tried to ignore it. I convinced myself it was pure coincidence. However, the following week, another book vanished. This time, it was a volume on the history of the town. When it reappeared, days later, I opened it with trembling hands, dreading what I might find. The pages were different again. The stories continued, now with even more specific details, as if the books were documenting what was happening in the library in real time. I read about people who had entered the library and never left, as if the books were absorbing their stories. As the days passed, I started to feel as if something was watching me. The atmosphere in the library changed, becoming heavy and oppressive. With every new book that disappeared and reappeared, the stories became more personal, as if I were becoming a part of them. I began avoiding the rare book section, but it was as if the books were calling to me, wanting me to read the next chapter. Then something happened that I can never forget. I was alone, closing the library late one night, when I heard the sound of pages turning. I went to the rare book section, and there it was, a thick leather-bound book open on the table. My name was on the pages. The words described every detail of what I had done that day, as if the book were writing my own story. And then, at the bottom of the page, something left me breathless. The final line said that, on that night, I would never leave the library. I slammed the book shut, trembling with fear. I ran out without looking back, feeling the weight of untold stories pressing down on my shoulders. I never returned to that library again. But sometimes, I wonder if someone else will one day find that book, and what they'll read on the remaining pages.